Okay, so here, let me give you an idea of what we're planning to do for the next couple of, well, three sessions at least. So we're trying to talk about gender and sexuality. We've made the observation that where we are at present is very different than where we have been historically. And we were asking the question, so how did we get here? Okay, because there's some big fundamental differences between where we are, where we have been, certainly between where we are and God's design for us. And so we are going to spend the next few sessions trying to figure out how we got to where we are. Now, we're not going to start in the 60s with the sexual revolution. Of course, some major changes took place in the 1960s, and we are really riding that wave right now in our culture. But you have to understand, it didn't begin then. Like the roots of this are much deeper, and they go back much further. And I've been very helped by a guy called Carl Trueman. Anybody ever heard of Carl Trueman? Raise your hand if you've heard of Carl Trueman. A few people have heard of Carl Trueman. I know y'all have heard of Carl Trueman. Yeah. Have the girls taken anything with him yet?
They say only seniors can get it.
Oh, that's too bad. So anyway, Carl Trueman teaches right now at Grove City College, and he's taught it. That's right. That's an inside joke. We'll move on. So he taught at Westminster for a while. I think he's at Grove City right now. But he's written some very helpful books I want to recommend to you. So part of what we're going to discuss this morning is going to come from those books. In fact, the title of your handout comes from one of those books. In 2020, he wrote a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, really trying to understand where the sexual revolution, where we are right now, fits within the broader flow of history, focusing on the self. Because the sexualization of the self is really just one movement in the broader flow of things. So understanding how we went inward and left outward. I'll explain that in a minute. And then a couple years later, he wrote a shorter version of it called Strange New World. So if you want to start reading this, that's a really good place to start. Carl Trueman's Strange New World. And then if you want to go with the deeper, bigger book, go with Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I want to read to you from the foreword of Strange New World to give you an idea of what he's trying to do. And then we're going to watch a video. The video is going to be about 30 minutes, so we won't have a ton of time at the end to talk, but hopefully we'll be able to understand what he's presenting here. I took several different videos, and I've kind of stitched them together to try to make sense of what he's talking about here. You'll see what I mean here in a minute. But let me read to you from the foreword here, from Strange New World. At the risk of oversimplifying what Trueman accomplishes, I would summarize the broad arc of his work as an account of how the person became a self, so the focus on the modern self, how the self became sexualized, and then how sex became politicized. I mean, that's a really good explanation of where we are, and that's a really good trajectory to follow to understand how we got where we are. Okay? And it's not that the self is a bad thing. You know, the biblical writers talk about the self. The Christian the theologians have talked about the self. But the inward turn, going back to the forward, of the biblical tradition was at the service of the outward turn toward God. So if we turn inward, we're doing so in order to turn outward and reflect God, to conform outwardly to God. Make sense? The self that Western civilization cultivated up until just a few hundred years ago was what Harvard political theorist Michael Sandel described as an encumbered self, in contrast to modernity's uncumbered self. The person was a creature of God who sought to conform himself to the truth, to objective moral standards in pursuit of eternal life. Modern man, however, seeks to be true to himself, rather than conform thoughts, feelings, and actions to objective reality. Man's inner life itself becomes the source of truth. The modern self finds himself in the midst of what Robert Bellah has described as a culture of expressive individualism. I want you to learn that term and know what it means. We're going to talk about it today. Where each of us seeks to give expression to our individual inner lives rather than seeing ourselves as embedded in communities and bound by natural and supernatural laws. Authenticity to inner feelings rather than adherence to transcendent truths becomes the norm. That's a really good explanation of what has happened. And what we're going to do over the next few lessons is understand historically how we got here and the implications of it. And I'm going to start this video with something you may have seen a few years ago on ABC News, an interview with a man called Bruce Jenner, who now calls himself Caitlyn Jenner. And this will tee you up for what Truman's going to talk about in the rest of it. So let's see if this works, Lord willing. You got your hand out. We'll try to follow through.
Are you a woman? Yes, for all intents and purposes, I am a woman. People look at me differently. They see you as this macho male, but my heart, my soul, and everything that I do in life, it is part of me. That female side is part of me. That's who I am. I was not genetically born that way. As a male, I have all the male parts and all that kind of stuff. So, in a lot of ways, we're different, okay? But we still identify as female. And that's very hard for Bruce Jenner to say. Because why? I don't want to disappoint people.
There's hundreds of millions of people who once cheered a real-life American superhero. 1976. He has just been proclaimed the greatest athlete in the world.
You were the world's greatest.
Athlete.
We see the fork.
Yeah.
You see what?
A confused person at that time. Running away from my life, running away from who I was.
With fear?
Big time fear, yeah. Scared to death. Didn't know what my future held at that time.
Help. Everybody's struggling with what this is.
That is me. That is her.
And people have to know that you can want to identify as a woman and still.
Kick butt.
Even as a small boy, he has a growing certainty that for some reason, the gender of his body is different from the gender he feels in his soul.
I look at guys and I go, he's comfortable in his own skin. You know? And I thought, wouldn't that be a nice way to go through life? I look at women all the time thinking, oh my God, how lovely are they that they can wake up in the morning and be themselves. But me, I'm stuck here in the middle. And I got nowhere to go. Which way do I go?
Expressive individualism is a term used by philosophers such as Charles Taylor to talk about the way we think about being selves in the present day. And expressive individualism particularly refers to the idea that in order to be fulfilled, in order to be an authentic person, in order to be genuinely me, I need to be able to express outwardly or perform publicly that which I feel I am inside. So expressive individualism in some ways overturns a lot of the notions of the self that the previous generations may have held to. I grew up in England, the idea of reserve, of not expressing one's emotions in public was very, very important to the kind of upbringing I had. Today, of course, when we look at, for example, reality television, we're presented constantly with images of people who are letting it all go, letting it out, letting it rip. So expressive individualism is simply this idea that the most authentic individual, the most real person, is the person who expresses or performs outwardly that which they are inwardly. That has obvious implications for the sexual revolution, because take, for example, the most extreme example of the sexual revolution, the whole notion of somebody being transgender. what does transgenderism claim? Well, it claims that somebody with the body of a man who yet feels inside that they are a woman has the right, the need to express outwardly in the way they dress, the way they behave, even the restrooms they care to use, has the right to express that inward conviction in their outward public behaviour. And you see this quite often in the testimonies of transgender people. If you look at the interview with Bruce Jenner, for example, that he did with Diane Sawyer, when he talked about really about finally being himself, about having lived a lie. That's language of expressive individualism, where the idea is that society has forced me to behave in certain ways that don't conform with my inner feelings and my inner convictions. And in a society where the expressive individual is increasingly the norm and increasingly presented as that which we should all be, then the idea of society itself forcing us to play a role that we don't feel comfortable with inside makes us inauthentic. So the sexual revolution, particularly in its transgender form, is a specific, I think, sexualized manifestation of this wider normative person. There is a sense in which expressive individualism correlates to some aspects of Christianity, because of course the Bible has much to say about hypocrites. It has a lot to say about those who pretend outwardly to be one thing and yet in reality are something quite different. And one might say that Augustine, in his great work, The Confessions, the psychological autobiography that he writes in the 390s, is giving expression to expressive individualism when he's talking about his inward feelings as he moves away from the church and then back to the church. So there's a sense in which that correlation between the inward and the outward and the importance of the inward life is something that lies very much at the heart of Christianity. One of the big differences, though, I think, between what we might call Christian expressive individualism and secular expressive individualism is that Christian expressive individualism acknowledges that there may be a problem with that which is inside. Augustine's expressive individualism, in his confessions, his crying out to God, is always a result of, well, he's moving inward in order to move outward to God. He's not moving inward simply to work out how he needs to express himself to his friends and his neighbours. He's moving inward in order to reach upwards to God and to try to bring that which is inward in conformity to the external will of God. So, expressive individualism, like a lot of things, captures something of the truth. Human beings, we do have an inner life, and that inner life is very important to who we are. But I think a Christian would say that the transgender person who acts out their transgender convictions in the public realm is really fooling themselves in a way that a Christian who knows inwardly he or she is sinful needs to repent, needs to turn to God, needs to go inwards in order to turn outwards to God and to Christ. That's where real authenticity lies. Many of you will be aware of a book by Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, which is his story of a dystopian future for humanity. When you see the title of my book, Strange New World, it should be fairly obvious that I'm playing on Aldous Huxley's title. Except my book is not addressing the future. My book is addressing the world in which we now find ourselves. Many of us who grew up in, say, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, find the world in which we now live to be a strange and alien one to that which we experienced as children. Even our children today might experience the world as strange to that which they knew just a couple of years ago. It seems very hard to believe, for example, that a mere 15 years ago, equivocating on gay marriage could have been electoral suicide at the polls in the United States of America. And yet now, any objections to something such as transgenderism could finish a career in public life. We live in a strange new world. And what I want to think about is why and how is that world so strange? And there are a number of things I think that contribute to that. First of all, and perhaps most difficult to articulate, is the incredible feeling of speed and change that many of us have about the environment in which we live. So little today seems to be constant. Everything seems to be constantly changing in a state of flux. Things that were certain just yesterday are being denied today. Why is it that the world in which we live gives us this feeling of vertigo, of dizziness, as we try to find something that might give us some level of continuity between yesterday, today, and tomorrow? The speed of change is dramatic and is frightening. Secondly, many of us have noticed over the last few years that everything in our world has become political. The old days where we would have organisations like, say, the Boy Scouts, or the local church, or the Girl Guides, or the Women's Institute. Some organisations that didn't have a strongly political dimension to them seem to have disappeared. Everything is now political. You may notice, for example, during Pride Month, how many big corporations in America send you emails if you're on their emailing list, assuring you of their support for Pride Month, assuring you of their support for various social and political causes. That's strange. It's strange, isn't it, that an institution like Amazon that just sells stuff goes out of its way to tell you how politically engaged it is. And it's disturbing, because it increasingly means that everything we say and do is subjected to political scrutiny. Everything we say and do identifies us somehow in the public square and makes us vulnerable to criticism. And we might connect to that the other strange thing that many of us are experiencing in the world today. And that is the collapse of the distinction between the public and the private. I remember growing up in Britain in the 1980s, and there was a clear distinction between public life, what one did, say, at work or at school, and what one did in the home. The latter was private, it was secret, only family members knew about it. And yet now we live in a world where the public and the private are increasingly blurred. The boundary between them has become increasingly dissolved, so that opinions you hold, even opinions that you express in a private context, may have public consequences for you. You might find yourself in trouble for something that you said you thought in a completely private and personal context, but which comes back to haunt you. And then there's the issue of sex. Isn't it strange how sex, once considered a very private activity between two individuals, has become one of the most pressing public issues of our day? And isn't it strange how sex has come to dominate our notions of identity, has come to grip the imagination? Think of the acronym LGBTQ. Think of what that says about the way we think of ourselves. It means that we come to identify our sexual desires with who we are at a very deep and foundational level. Perhaps some of you have had the heartbreak of a child or a relative coming to you and saying, we think we're gay, or we think we're bi. And they may never have had a sexual experience. But the very fact they experience certain desires deeply shapes how they think of themselves and how they think of their identity. What I suggest in my book, and what I want to tease out in these lectures and in the study guide, is that underlying all of these things is the sense of the human self. There is something that binds together the chaos of our current world. There is something that provides unity and coherence to the way we experience the apparent chaos and change and flux around us. And that's the changing notion of the human self. Today we tend to think of the self as self-creating. We tend to think of the self as unhinged from any constant thing around us, and rooted entirely in our self-consciousness. We might put it this way. In times past, when you'd ask somebody who they were, they might have told you they were the son of somebody, or they belonged to a certain nation, they did a certain job, they belonged to a certain family. They would describe themselves, we might say, in terms of their obligations to and dependence upon other people. The way we think about selves today is very often as autonomous, as free-floating, as determining ourselves. And that can be a very attractive idea in some ways, because it plays to our intuitions of freedom. It plays to our desire to be free to determine who we are in and of ourselves. And yet when you think about it, when you extrapolate that to your view of life as a whole, it's also a very frightening prospect, because it means the only constant thing in this world is you. And that everything else that exists sort of exists in a kind of adversarial relationship to you. And then when you throw into the mix things like technology that profoundly shape the way we experience the world on a day-to-day basis, and the way technology is constantly changing and therefore constantly reshaping that experience, that can be very worrying and profoundly disorienting. And what I want you to think about at this point is how that contrasts with the biblical teaching of self. What I mean by self here is not the understanding you're you and I'm me. I mean an understanding of what it means to be a human being, how we find our identity, how we find our purpose in life, how we find our meaning. Contrast the independent, free-floating self of today with the teaching of the Bible. Think about human beings made in the image of God. Think about how the identity of Adam and Eve was actually grounded in something external to themselves. It was grounded in God. It was grounded in His image. Think about that statement where God looks down and He sees Adam all on his own and He thinks that it's not good for Adam to be alone. What is God saying there? Is He perhaps saying that Adam only finds his completion and fulfillment when he stands in relation to another one of his own kind, who is the same but different in an interesting and significant way? Think about the way the biblical narrative develops the account of humanity. Think about human beings, particularly the people of Israel, when God brings His law to them, when God gives them His commands. Right at the heart of those commands is that the people of Israel are to be hospitable. To be hospitable to who to? To their neighbours, to the sojourner, to the stranger in the midst. Why are they to do that? It's because God is a hospitable God. In other words, God is defining human beings at all levels as those who are dependent upon and have obligations to others. So one of the things I want you to do at the end of this first lecture is to think about that. Think about how you think about yourself. Think about how you think about job satisfaction. How you think about your family. How you think about your relationship to others. And ask yourself, how much of that modern understanding of the self that places me at the centre, makes me independent, that makes me self-defining, stands at odds with the basic definitions of selfhood and the basic history of selfhood that we find in the biblical narrative of the people of God, made in God's image and ultimately redeemed in the Lord Jesus Christ. Imagine going to a doctor maybe 100 years ago and saying to a doctor, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body." Your doctor would have responded, "Well, that's a problem. That's a problem with your mind, and we need to address your mind in order to bring it into line with your body." If you were to go to your doctor today and say the same thing, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," your doctor would certainly say to you, "That's a problem." And he's likely to say to you, "That's a problem with your body, and we need to bring your body into line with your mind." Now, when you compare those two anecdotes, it's very clear that something remarkable has happened between those two events. Something very deep has taken place within our culture. And I would say what's taking place is this: that our feelings, our psychology, how we think, that voice inside our heads, if you like, has taken on peculiar authority, such that not even our bodies now are considered powerful enough or authoritative enough to override it. And that's not just the opinion of doctors, of course, but it's become the opinion of people in general in society. The question is, how has that taken place? How have our feelings become so authoritative? Well, it's a long story. It doesn't begin in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It really begins hundreds of years ago. I'm going to start the story with a man called Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was an 18th century philosopher, and Rousseau's great insight into what it meant to be human was this: that it was society that messes us up, that it was society that squeezes us into its mould, and that the real you, the real me, the real person, were the inner feelings, uncoerced, untrammeled, unsqueezed into a mould by society. Rousseau was the man who articulated this. He said, you know, the way to produce real, authentic people, kind people, empathetic people, is to try to make society conform to our inner feelings, or to get society out of the way. Rousseau's thinking might be summed up by saying, you are what you feel. It is that inner voice of nature, that cry of nature within you, that determines who you are. Now, Rousseau was a philosopher, and not many people today will have read Rousseau. Maybe some of you have not even heard of him, yet I guarantee you that the world in which you live and the way that you perhaps think, certainly the way I think, has been shaped in powerful ways, intuitive ways, by the thought of Rousseau. One of the reasons for this is that Rousseau's thought was popularised by an artistic movement that we now refer to as Romanticism in the late 18th, early 19th century. Maybe you're familiar with some of the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley, or William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, perhaps the paintings of J.M.W. Turner or Caspar David Friedrich. Perhaps you prefer music. Perhaps you've listened to some of the powerful music of Franz Liszt, or you're a Beethoven fan, and you listen to Beethoven and you've noticed that in his late string quartets, he's starting to sound a little different. One of the things you notice about these artists is they appeal to the emotions. The way they write their poetry, the way they paint their paintings, the way they compose their music, is not so much to reflect a structure and an order, as it is to appeal directly to the heart. And that really comes out of that way of thinking that we find embodied in the world of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where an important part of who you are is what you feel. An important part of who you are is your psychology. Now, it's a long way from William Wordsworth to Caitlyn Jenner. It's a long way from Romanticism to transgenderism. But what we notice with the Romantic movement is this: that priority on feelings as providing the authentic you is starting to emerge very powerfully in the artistic world of the late 18th and early 19th century. Now, what we think about today, first of all, I think it's important to realise that Romanticism, and Rousseau even, is not entirely wrong in this. Think about the Psalms. Think about the amount of emotions that there are in the Psalms. The Bible's very clear that human beings are emotional beings. The things that inspire us to action are often love and hate. They're things that we feel as much as things that we think, perhaps things that we feel more so. Think of the story of David and Bathsheba. Think of how his kingdom is train-wrecked because of his inner passions and his inner feelings. Think of Psalm 88 and the expression of emotion there. The psalmist is lamenting there. We might say the psalmist is identified with his feelings and with his lamentation there. And notice the form of the Psalms. The Psalms are poetry. Why are they poetry? Because poetry appeals to more than just our reason, more than just our brains on sticks, if you like. Poetry appeals to our emotions. So I want to say that Romanticism certainly captures something that's important and true about what it means to be a human being. We're not just brains on sticks. We're feeling creatures. We have an inner space. We are emotional. And those things are important to who we are. Notice the power of art as well. How much of the way we think, even about the world around us today, is shaped not so much by arguments we read, but by stories we know, by movies we watch, by music we listen to. And this is where it gets tricky, I think, for Christians. Think about your approach to, say, sexual morality. Think about your approach to worldly possessions. Think about your approach to what constitutes good and the beautiful. And then ask yourself, how much of what you believe or think about those issues is rooted in you thinking back to first principles, to you thinking in terms of arguments and reason? And how much of how you think about those things is really shaped by, say, television programs you've watched, or by stories you've heard, or by friendships you've had, by relationships you've experienced? Think about how much of the way you think about morality is perhaps shaped not so much by reason as it is by what we might call gut reaction, by feelings. Think about the language we often use today about morality. We often use language of feeling, don't we? I find that comment offensive. What that person did was hurtful. That was a very distasteful thing to do. When you think about language like that, that's pointing us towards, I would say, that kind of romantic sensibility. That human beings, we're constituted by our feelings, we're constituted by our emotions, we're constituted by our passions. And then ask yourself, to what extent is that a legitimate position for a Christian to have? Now, don't get me wrong, I certainly want to say that feelings are important in the way that Christians operate morally. If I look out of the window and I see something really bad being done to somebody, say I see an old lady being attacked in the street, and I don't instinctively feel that is wrong, and instinctively feel outrage, instinctively want to help her, then you say, well, prudence of morally defective being in some way. Feelings are very, very important. But then ask yourself, how do we balance feelings with reason? Or perhaps better still, how do we make sure that our feelings are properly attuned to the moral principles that the Bible articulates? Think about some aspect of biblical teaching, moral teaching, that perhaps you know in your head is right, but you find it really difficult to apply in your daily life and in your interactions with others. Think about why you might feel that difficulty. Is it because a soap opera or a sitcom sent an image of that thing that you know is a virtue and presented it as a vice? Has it taught you to feel wrongly about that good thing? So, to go back to where I started this lecture, that prioritising that we see in the modern world of feelings over what we might say external authority, even the authority of our body, that really starts in the 18th century. The complicated thing is it's not an entirely bad thing. But knowing that story, knowing how feelings have come to dominate how we think, and bringing them to bear against biblical teaching, that's going to be part of the key for us to think correctly and morally about the world in which we now find ourselves as we move forward.
All right. John, can you get those lights? Thanks. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea as you're beginning to see that you can't just drop in to where we're currently at with our view of gender and sexuality and really understand how to even make sense of it. These concepts, these ideas seem so foreign to us that we almost have to go back and understand how we got to where we are. And that's what this is trying to do. So he's starting a couple hundred years ago, and he's following the movement inward with not just inward, but inward with a disconnect from the outward. Okay? So he described the difference between secular expressive individualism and Christian expressive individualism, right? And all he means by these things is it's the focus on the inner life. Okay, here would be one definition, if you like. A philosophical and cultural concept emphasizing personal expression, individuality, and self-fulfillment. That's what expressive individualism is getting at. And it could be good or bad, depending on what we do with it. So he talked about Augustine spends a lot of time in his Confessions thinking inwardly about himself and self-reflection. But what makes people like Augustine so different from secular expressive individualists is Augustine is willing to identify problems internally. So when he looks inward, biblically, when we look inward, it's not all roses. We can look inward and we can see problems. We can see disorder. We can see rebellion. We can see evil. Which means we then have to conform the inner self to God's outer world, God's outer standards that exist independent of us, such that what is good and bad, right and wrong, flourishing and destructive has to be defined somewhere outside of me. And so Christian expressive individualism will be able to balance the emphasis on us as individual selves, emotional and all the rest, in conformity to a standard that is not determined by us. And that is the huge fundamental difference between Christianity and secularism, is the standard of conformity isn't internal, it's external. And now, once we kind of understand how the past couple hundred years have moved away from that external standard of conformity to self-determination, now we can be able to say, okay, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Why a person could say that they're a woman living in a man's body. Because not even the external body has the authority to determine self. My inner feelings have that ultimate authority. So this is why it's so important to understand the history of it. What we're going to do next time is move from, okay, now we're beginning to see that movement internal, but now how do we unhitch the emphasis internally from the external authority of God? That's what we're going to talk about with Nietzsche and Marx. And then we need to say, okay, now once we've completely unhitched it, now we're completely inward, now we're completely self-determining and self-defining, how does it become so sexualized, like we've seen for the past 50, 60 years? And that's going to bring us to people like Freud and others who have taken this whole movement inward, the detachment from anything external, and completely sexualized it and then politicized it to bring us to where we are today. Now, in a few lessons, when we get to that point, we have a grasp on how we've gotten to where we are, then we'll be ready to respond to it. Okay? So that's where we're going. Any questions on what we've covered today or maybe where we're going? It kind of makes sense on why we're doing this. Kind of odd to go through a history like this when we're just talking about gender and sexuality. But you're going to see, like, this is you can't look at this today without doing this, or you're going to be completely lost.